Well, it's great to be in front of so many people who are dedicated to helping autistic individuals to lead fulfilling and productive lives. And I can't think of a better way of going about it than the India Autism Center, as we have been talking about, as we've been working towards. So let us now open the doors to looking at how we can make fulfilling and productive lives for autistic individuals the rule rather than the exception. So let us begin by jumping into the mind of the autistic individual with the game of what's the difference between the pictures on the top and on the bottom. So who's got a difference? Who wants to point out a difference? Difference between the top and the bottom. Who's got one for me? You got one over here, okay. All right, so if we're looking over here, we've got a blue bridle, and we've got a red one up here. Okay, there's 12 more to go. Who's got another one? Who's got one? Over here, yes. Say that again? All right, well that's the optics, but it's supposed to be the same distance. But that might be another one. That's who's got one? Oh yes, over here, Robert.
The bottom one is missing the two round things in the bottom.
All right, so down here, see there's 1 missing, 2, 3, and here there's 1, 2, 3, 4. And there's a whole bunch more, which we see right here. And I think I might have even missed a few. So as we consider what we were looking at, now it's quiz time. What was it a picture of? Merry-go-round. What is the animal in the foreground? Zebra, horse? We're not exactly sure. What color is the animal behind the first one? Brown. How many animals are in the row closest to us? It's getting a little bit harder to answer. But anyways, here they are, so now you can get all the questions right. Now what I did is that in forcing you to perceive this picture, like us autistic individuals perceive the environment, you focused on details at the expense of the whole. And this is the central coherence. Often it's referred to as being a deficit in central coherence, getting the big picture. However, other situations where it's advantageous to be detail-oriented. Who's got one? Detail-oriented situations. All right, entry technician?
X-ray.
Some sort of technician.
X-ray.
Oh, X-ray. Yeah, sometimes it's not quite, all the syllables don't quite make it up here. X-ray technician, IT, proofreader, mechanic, engineering. These are situations where it's advantageous to be detail-oriented. And it might even be possible to say that if we put a typical person in such a situation, maybe they have a deficit in detail-oriented thinking. And the reason why I bring this up is that we can take the characteristics of autism, we can flip them around and look at them as strengths. And what that requires for us to do is to reframe how we think about the characteristics. When we talk about the definition of autism, we so often hear deficits in communication, social interaction, restricted interests, repetitive motions, all these deficits. What if we just look at them as characteristics, just as they are? Neither good nor bad, and we try to make the best with what we have. And in thinking about the characteristics this way, how do we determine the strengths of the individual? And what I do when somebody asks me, what is my autistic son, daughter, person I'm supporting, or an autistic person asks me, what am I good at? I answer the question with a question, how do they spend most of their time, or would they if they were allowed to do it? And that tends to lead to areas of strengths and interest. We tend to spend more time doing things that we like. We tend to be good at the things we like to do. So my questions are, what are the abilities of the person? What are the interests? What kind of mind does the person have? What is the processing style of the autistic person? How many of you people vote for visual? That we are visual beings? Yeah, most of us are, but the key word is most, not all. I know some non-visual autistics. I know some who are so non-visual they can't read a map. So what we can say is that while probably we'll be visually based, we might not be, but whatever it is probably going to be to some sort of extreme and possibly to the expense of others. So how do we find these strengths? How do we find the abilities? Well, one way to get some answers is to increase what we usually know and move that level down, because so often what we see is just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. And that's where organizations such as Identifor come in. And let's see if we can get the computer to go to the next slide. Oh, there it is. And Desiree was talking about this a little bit earlier. There's 2 or 3 dozen fun games that you're invited to play. You play with these games, then the software looks at reaction times, correct answers, and so on, and puts it all together and then spits out some suggestions as to what the person might be good at and what are some career possibilities. So that's something that you may want to consider looking at. So what this does is it brings us directly into the idea of what I call the 3 A's of autism. The 3 A's of autism. The first A, that's easy. We've been doing that for the past generation. And that's awareness. We've gotten pretty good at knowing when autism is in our midst. With a current prevalence rate of 1 in 68, if the rate keeps rising the way it's been going, probably within the next generation, there's going to be more of us autistics than not. We're taking over. So we're pretty good at that. When we see it, we know it. And what that does is build a foundation for acceptance. And how do you know when we see acceptance of autistic individuals? That's when we see people transitioning from, and it could be a parent, could be a therapist, could be a politician talking about autism. When we transition from doing things to autistic individuals, we got to get rid of these characteristics. We got to get rid of this horrible thing that's afflicting our child or the individual to, well, these characteristics are something that we can work with. So it's a transition from doing things to working with the characteristics, with the abilities. And we're beginning to see that in, for example, employment. There are some small software companies that actively seek autistic individuals for IT jobs. Small companies such as Microsoft and SAP and Google and Apple. Oh, that's a computer company. But anyways, you get the idea. And so these companies realize that we have something to contribute that perhaps other people may not be able to. Now, one thing that I always think about when I hear about all of these IT geeks and all the writing about IT geeks, that's all well and good and that's great. However, only a minority of us are IT geeks. My question always is, what about the rest of us? Those of us who have strengths in other areas. And what about those of us who perhaps aren't superstars in various areas? People who are more significantly affected, who need more supports. People who, for example, not that we provide some support and training for and we let them loose into the work environment, and that we provide training for the employers as well, and then we all let them loose and they contribute and do wonderful things. Some interesting flashing effects going on here. But what about the people who will need more regular support? So for example, I know of an individual who's pretty significantly affected. He doesn't speak. He needs a lot of supports. And one thing he really likes is to pull laundry out of a dryer and fold it perfectly so the creases are just so. How many of you would like someone to fold and put away your laundry? Well, this guy lives in Florida, and you're going to have to pay him to do it. That is his job. And he does his job well. It's meaningful for him to do so. And he's happy doing it, and he's earning a living as a result. This is how we need to be looking at the characteristics of autism. And in doing so, we move from acceptance to appreciation. And that's valuing autistic individuals for what we can contribute to the world, to the community. So as you go through today's conference, as you go through tomorrow, the next day, and as you go about supporting autistic individuals, my question to you are, what steps are you going to take to climb those stairs of awareness, acceptance, and appreciation of people with differences in your own life? And if you're one of us autistic individuals like Chris over here, like Gwen over here, like me, like some various others who may have yet to be diagnosed, what are you going to do to accept your abilities and strengths and work with those? Nobody's made a career out of remediated weaknesses. You may need to be asking, what can the person do? So in doing so, it means rethinking how we think about people who have differences. So often I read in reports, I hear teachers talking in teachers' rooms, I hear professionals using all of these kinds of words to describe people who learn differently. These are deficit model words. Might we be able to reframe them? Reframe these words like this. And in that way, turning away from a model of deficit to an abilities-based model and asking what the person can do. So that goes into working with individuals as well. Now let's take a look at Randy the artist. I was called into a family in Los Angeles where I met this middle school student. He didn't speak very much either, and he loved to draw. That's all he would do. And these drawings were pretty artistic. They were abstract. I wasn't quite sure what they were, but they were nice. You know, it's one of those things, you know good art when you see it, but you can't always verbalize it. So he's been doing this for a long time. And when people tried to, if anybody would take these drawing tools away from him, he'd have a meltdown. So they call in the behavioral consultant. And the consultant says, well, we've identified a powerful reinforcer. It's all of this drawing stuff, the crayons, the paper, and whatnot. So let's get Randy to do this so that he can get that. It's never worked. So anyways, here's this Randy guy. He's drawing away. I come on the scene. And so I'm looking at, why is he doing what he's doing? He's doing this, well, for one, he's keeping himself regulated. He's not having meltdowns when he's drawing. When you take the stuff away, then he has these horrific meltdowns. Might there be a way to work with what Randy is doing? Let's work with the interest. So there I am. I sit down with Randy. He's coloring on his side of the paper. I sit on the other side, kitty corner. I pick up a crayon. I'm kind of drawing squiggles and squares, sort of like what he's doing. He looks at me, then he goes about his business. I wonder, how close can I get to his drawing before he does something? And I find that I can go all the way up and border right on what he's doing. He's got no problem with that. What if I dare to take one of my crayons and color inside a space that he's left open? He was okay with that as well. Well, I don't know how much communication Randy has. Well, what color is this crayon? Blue. Did a whole bunch of other colors. All right, he knows his colors and he can tell me what they are. Randy, pick up the red crayon. He picks it up. Or I might say, what color is this? Here. He would take it and he'd use that color. Randy, give me the black crayon. He'd give it to me. I draw. So what I learned from that is that if I worked with Randy, with his interests, then we would go a lot further. And why did he tolerate me coming into his world and touching his sacred objects? Somehow he must have sensed that I was there to work with him. I wasn't there to take his stuff away and then make him earn it, but I was there to work with his materials and let's see what we can build together. So it's more collaborative. I'm asking, what can Randy do? So a little bit about me. What brings me here to talk to you about autism? Well, let's take it from the beginning. At 24 hours of age, my wife says I look like an egg. And then at 18 months, what happens to about 30% of us, the regressive autism bomb exploded. And it exploded into so many pieces that you can't even see it. And I lost functional communication, had meltdowns, withdrew from the environment, and so in brief, I became a pretty autistic little kid. There was so little known about autism in those days that it took my parents a whole year to find a place for diagnosis. And then when they did, the doctor said, well, we've never seen a child who was so sick. You better send him to an institution. Well, fortunately, my parents, like we see so many parents today, they advocated on my behalf, and they convinced the school to take me in about a year. And it was during that year that they implemented what we would today refer to as an intensive home-based early intervention program. And this was a program emphasizing music, movement, sensory integration, narration, imitation. Probably looked like one of the more developmental cognitive, such as the Miller method, or relational approaches such as floor time or RDI that we see today. But in those days, even the concept of early intervention didn't even exist. Jean Ayres was just getting started in realizing the potential of occupational therapy. I don't even know if it was called, I don't even think it was called sensory integration therapy then, but she was just beginning to figure these things out. So that's what my parents did. And with the work that they did, speech began to return at age 4. And what did they do? Well, first they tried to get me to imitate them. And that didn't work. So then they flipped it around and imitated me. And once they did that, I became aware of them in my environment. Then they were able to move me along, and speech began to return. And I think the key implication is that before you do any good work with an autistic individual, you have to develop that trusting relationship first. Then you can move on. So moving on. Now it's age 4. Speech is beginning to return. I entered the school that initially rejected me. I got reevaluated. Instead of being considered as psychotic and ready for an institution, I got upgraded to neurotic. So things were looking better in the world. I discovered watch motors. I was found taking apart a watch like this with a sharp knife. I pop open the back, extract the motor, take the gears apart, put it all back together again. The watch still worked, and there weren't any pieces left over. So incredible fine motor control to take apart a watch. But then my question is, where did that motor control go when it came to penmanship? So that's a question that you can ask your favorite occupational therapist over here. And we're still not exactly sure why that happens, but I know a number of autistic people who can take tiny little things apart and then, but when it comes to penmanship, well, and get them back together again. So the watch still worked, there weren't any pieces left over. But writing is different. So there's a number of theories as to why that might be. So, moving along, how do we prepare for success for the individual? Well, one area is self-advocacy. It's something that we need a lot more discussion on, a lot more teaching about. Educating autistic individuals in successful or effective self-advocacy skills. Well, how does that work? The self-advocacy is something that most people take for granted. All right, you're lost, you ask for directions, here they are. Of course, everybody's going to memorize these directions, but in case you don't, just in case you don't, now what do you do? Well, first you realize there's too much to remember. That's the first step. You recognize the challenge. The second step is you ask for an accommodation. Here it's time. Hold on a minute. Can you wait for me to get something to take this down? And number 3, you have to give the reason why. I'm not going to remember it all. Thanks for waiting. So what we've done is we've broken down effective self-advocacy into scanning the environment for challenges, effective advocacy on one's behalf, and then disclosing or giving the reason why. So here's a real simple example. Many of you think this hat's a fashion statement, and in many ways it is. And it's always good to support my university, Adelphi University, that's where I teach, but it's really an accommodation. Many of us have visual sensitivities. For many of us, fluorescent lights appear like strobe lights to most people. Now, strobe lights fun on vacation, it's fun on holidays, it's fun at parties, but would you last an entire day in a room lit with a strobe light as you tried to do your work? It's not going to happen. Fortunately for me, while I don't like fluorescent lights, I can live with them. For me, it's recessed lighting fixtures. And those are the fixtures that you see kind of stuck up in the ceiling. It looks like they're in a coffee can and they shine down. Usually you can see the light bulb. Standing under one of those, for me, is like looking into one of those spotlights for most of you. Here's the accommodation. All right, I figured that out. How does that work into an employment situation? I'm shown an office by my supervisor. I see that it's lit with a type of lighting that I'm just not going to get along with that lighting. But I know what to do about it. So I've scanned the environment for the challenge. I've figured out what needs to be done. Now it's time to advocate. Mr. Supervisor, I noticed that there's only one worker in the office wearing a hat. I wonder if it's okay if I wear a hat too. There it is, 2 sentences, simple, supervisor can understand it, provide support. If I'm going to ask for an accommodation or greater understanding, I have to give the reason why. Here comes the disclosure. Because these lights give me a headache, I must have sensitive eyes. So I did a partial disclosure. I didn't talk about autism, that would have been too much. That would have been a full disclosure, just a partial one. This is the reason why. And if I'm in really good form, I might even say to the supervisor, I'll be much more productive for your workplace if I can wear this hat. It's something that so many of us take for granted, but for many of us autistic individuals, this may be something that we have to provide direct instruction in. At age 8, I spent hours cracking open small rocks with a big rock. I was fascinated by the shiny specks inside, the sharp edges. That grew into a special interest in geology, geography, many others. Astronomy was another interest. I'd spend most of my elementary school days getting all the books on my favorite subjects, reading them, taking notes, copying diagrams. And then when I was done with that category, I'd put them all back and find something else to be interested in. I remember in 3rd grade, I had a stack of astronomy books on my desk, and a teacher told me that I'd never learn how to do math. But somehow I figured out just enough math to teach statistics at the university level. So just a little bit. Well, the good news is that today I'd see a lot more educators noticing something like this as a focused interest and find a way to work with it, and a way to teach math. There's plenty of math in astronomy. Not, for example, saying if you do this in math for 20 minutes, you can have the remaining 10 minutes using the astronomy simulator on the computer, for example. But let's use the interest to do some real math problems and make it intrinsically reinforcing. Bicycles started becoming interesting to me, and I got it to a point where I could take a bicycle apart down to the ball bearings and get that back together again. So how many of you know autistic individuals who kind of fit this definition? I don't know if I'm going to be able to get it up. Here we go. So as Tony Atwood used to say, an interest of such great intensity that it interferes with daily functioning. So how many of you know people like that? They get in the way. Well, Tony Atwood realized that this was a deficit model, and he doesn't use that anymore. We can rephrase that. An interest of such great intensity that it provides powerful motivation for learning mathematics, for learning curriculum, exploring career opportunities, whatever it might be. So here are some of my special interests. They come and they go. Sometimes there's more than one of them at a time. Make sure you get them all, because there will be a quiz at the end. So, moving along, we zoom up to middle school. Now, you don't need to be autistic to have difficulty in middle and high school. So many changes occur. But for me, it was actually easier, because in middle school, that's where you start seeing courses, clubs, and activities based on particular interests. Being interested in music, I joined the band. Now I had a structured activity in which to mediate my interactions with others. I got so fascinated with music that I got it into my autistic head that I needed to learn how to play all the instruments. Hours in the instrument closet, of course taking the instruments apart, getting them back together again, sometimes combining them in ways that they shouldn't have been combined. Ever take a bassoon reed and put it on a trombone? Interesting. Well, I didn't learn them all, but I did get it up to about 15. And that's part of the reason that I give music lessons to autistic children. Because in addition to all the therapeutic benefits you get by engaging in music, and that's what music therapy is all about, you're also learning a real-life skill in which to develop interactions with others as a musician, getting involved in the community. Also, music is just plain old fun. And then finally, I haven't figured out how to teach typical kids yet, so I just stick with the ones on the autism spectrum. They make so much more sense to me. So, zooming up to college. College was a utopia. And we're also seeing more and more autistic young adults going into college, because with better awareness comes better research, comes better interventions, comes better education. So all of those supports that we're seeing in grade school now need to be bumped up to the college level. And where there are colleges having these programs to support autistic individuals, they're doing really well. I remember the first day I started at my university, I met this student assistant, and I guess it takes one to know one. I just knew he was autistic. And I thought, well, I'll get to know him better, maybe we'll have a little talk about autism later. Well, on day 2, I saw him again. He disclosed to me that he was autistic, and they had flunked out of 2 universities before coming to Adelphi University. He got involved in the Bridges to Adelphi program, and now he was getting a 4.0 because he was getting the support that he needed. We've done some research and found that students enrolled in this autistic support program, they have a higher grade point average than the general population. They also have a higher retention rate, which translates into students staying longer and paying more tuition. So there's every reason to help these individuals. And also, it makes me wonder if we should provide some of those supports to students who don't have autism. Because if they're doing better than everybody else, maybe we're providing something that everybody else needs. And what that tells me is that what's good for autistic individuals tends to be good for everybody else. College is where you see a lot of dating. Could never quite figure that out. I remember after spending a lot of time with this lady, she told me that she really likes hugs and back rubs. I guess that has particular meaning. But what I thought was I had a friend who doubled as a deep pressure Temple Grandin squeeze machine. I guess she had other ideas. After a lot of conversation, I realized she wanted to be my girlfriend. Well, I wasn't interested. Well, that made me realize that I need to do a little research in this area. Oh, Dating for Dummies, all kinds of other books. The sheer quantity of these relational dating and self-help books also suggested to me that maybe this is a challenge for a lot of people in a lot of areas, not just autistic individuals. Well, now we get to college and spending a lot of time with this lady, reviewing each other's homeworks, doing things socially, and then one day at a beach like this, she gave me a hug, a kiss, and held my hand. But now I had the social story down, and it went something like this. If a woman hugs you, kisses you, and holds your hand all at about the same time, it probably means they want to be your girlfriend. And if that's the case, you better have an answer right away. It could either be yes, no, or further investigation and analysis is indicated. Well, it seemed to be a good thing to do, and now we've been married for over 28 years, And if you want to find out what life is like on her side of the spectrum, you can read her contributions to my book, Beyond the Wall. So I guess in a way, those professionals were right, that I needed to be sent to an institution. But what they didn't realize, hello? Hello? Rob, it's for you. What they didn't realize is that I would end up in an institution of higher education, which some people consider as being a sheltered workshop for people with Asperger's syndrome. I mean, look at it. We get to perseverate on our favorite subject, get paid for it, and talk to people about it until we're blue in the face, and they have to listen. I think we call them our students. So this is what I do most of the time when I'm not out talking about autism, teaching and researching into issues related to autism. And then finally, in closing, are we going to look at autism as a series of deficits, disorder, and disability? Or is autism a set of abilities? And what are you going to do to transform what might be considered a weakness or a challenge of yours into a strength? And just to get you started, I guess, there, it's all there. We can look at some of the areas that we so often consider as deficits, and we can translate them into abilities. So I want to thank you for for your participation, all you're doing to make fulfilling and productive lives for autistic individuals the rule rather than the exception. And if you have questions while I'm here today and tomorrow, there'll also be a panel later on. These are some of my books. I did happen to bring just a few, literally few, Vanna White. I mean, do you want to? There we go. So we can all be dummies, and in a way we all are, because there's so little that we know about autism, and there's so much more that we all need to know, and I think the India Autism Center is going to go a long way in furthering this knowledge. Thank you very much.